right, everybody. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Marie Price, professor at George Washington University. Marie and her panel are going to speak about the geographic implications of migration, immigration, and resettlement. Marie?
Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here in the city of New York, the ultimate immigrant gateway. And so today, the inspiration for today's panel was to turn our focus on how immigrants and migrants, but mostly immigrants, are changing cities in the world. And we're going to start with Nisha Agarwal, who is the commissioner from the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, someone from the policy world who deals with the day-to-day concerns of having a large number of immigrants in the urban setting. And then we have Dr. Audrey Singer, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, an immigration scholar, and she will talk about immigrant integration in US metropolitan areas, expanding to the view from the nationally. She'll be followed by Dr. David Rain from George Washington University, who spent many years looking at mobility and migration in the African context. He spent 2 years in Niger in the Peace Corps and also has ongoing work in Accra, Ghana. And he'll give a perspective from sub-Saharan Africa, not just immigration, but how migration is changing cities. And then I will end with a brief presentation on where I think the world's global immigrant gateways, cities with over 1 million people, will be in 2050, over 1 million immigrants, that is. So we will each speak for about 7 minutes, and hopefully we'll have time for everyone in the room who's interested to ask questions of the panel. Thank you very much. Nisha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Price and the Geographical Society, for having me here this morning. I was saying I don't often get a chance to talk to a crowd like this, so really excited to share with you some of the work we've been doing at the New York City Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, or MOIA, we are essentially a bridge between City Hall and New York City's many diverse immigrant communities. We were voted into the charter for New York City in 2001, but we actually started a much smaller form as a division of the Department of City Planning back in 1986. So it's an office that's been around for a while. We're the first city in the country to actually have a charter-mandated Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. And here you'll see our mission, which is really simply to promote the well-being of immigrant families in New York City. And so that really gives us wide berth to do a number of different programs and policies and advise the mayor on issues affecting migrants in New York City. Our 3 goals in this administration really, for one, support the Mayor de Blasio's larger agenda around challenging inequalities in New York City. Our sort of 3 pillars of work. The first is simply to think about programs and work on programs that promote immigrant integration, a range of different ways in which immigrants sometimes face barriers in accessing city services and moving through the city effectively and sort of really thriving. And so our office tries to think about ways to limit and remove those barriers. And I'll talk about some examples of those. The second big bucket is around access to justice. So being an immigrant in the United States, whether authorized or unauthorized, the law often determines kind of your relationship to how you exist within the city. And the lack of access to legal counsel and quality legal information very significantly impacts immigrant families. And so we have a number of different projects to think about how to support access to justice for immigrants in New York City. And then finally, the very nature of immigration in the US is that so much of the policy is determined at the federal level and to some extent also at the state level. And so we do advocacy with sister cities around the country to lift up the voice of cities and our concern with and interest in immigration issues and do some advocacy around this, around the country. And we use a range of different strategies, from policy to education and outreach, advocacy and communications, to really move forward in each of these 3 pillars of work. Here are some examples of the types of projects that we have in each of the pillars of work. I will dive into a few of these in more detail in a minute, but it gives you a sense of the range on immigrant integration, things like addressing language barriers and eliminating them, working with our fellow agencies to ensure they provide interpretation and translation. Thinking through immigration fraud, it's an astoundingly huge problem in a city like New York, where immigrants will go to the local notario or fraudulent provider, spend thousands of dollars and either get very poor quality service or no service at all, and suddenly they've lost thousands of dollars. So really thinking about how to tackle this large but often quite elusive problem to solve. And then finally, here are a couple of the coalitions that we work with nationally that we helped to create in the last year, both on citizenship as well as advocating for immigration reform federally. To give you some context of what we're talking about in New York City, about 37% of New York City's population of just over 8 million are foreign-born New Yorkers. So that's more than 3 million people. We have more immigrants in New York City than there are people in Chicago. So it's a pretty significant population. Once you add the children of those immigrants, it's 60% of the city. And a few other facts to throw out at you: more than half of our families in New York City speak a language other than English at home. A quarter are limited English proficient, and that means that they don't speak, read, understand English well enough to interact in health settings with city agencies, that there are those language barriers that exist and are significant for those families. And finally, we estimate that somewhere between 500,000 to 600,000 New Yorkers are undocumented, and so don't have legal status or have fallen out of legal status to be in the United States. And as you can see, the sort of geography of New York City's migrants is pretty, on the one hand, it's a huge city and a huge geographic footprint, but on the other hand, immigrants tend to be clustered in particular neighborhoods. And so for an office like mine, that's helpful in terms of thinking about doing outreach and where to really build community relationships and community presence. So now to sort of share with you a little bit about the concrete ways in which we attempt to promote the well-being of immigrant families in New York City. One very high-profile program that we launched this year, and the mayor has really taken a lead on, is the city's new Municipal ID program. So unfortunately, currently in New York State, both federal government-issued identification and state government-issued identification, like driver's licenses, are not available to people who are undocumented. So as a result, you have parents who can't pick their kids up at school because they don't have an ID to show the guard at the school. You have individuals who may be, involved in riding their bike on the sidewalk and get stopped by a police officer, and because they don't have ID, they actually get brought into the precinct. Very basic ways in which the lack of ID impacts people's lives. And beyond that, New York City is not a city where a lot of people drive. It's something like half of the driving age adults in New York City don't have a New York State driver's license. So this issue of identification really jumped out for the mayor as a barrier, not just for immigrants, but really across the board, and the feeling that with ID, New Yorkers are better off, and New York City as a city is safer. And so this was one of the top priorities that the mayor announced as part of his platform when he took office 2 years ago. And what's been pretty remarkable about pulling this program together, we were sort of balancing two interests. One was to make sure we reach this particularly vulnerable population of the undocumented, who historically have been resistant to interacting with government for a lot of the obvious reasons that you can imagine, but also who have a huge need for this kind of program. We also didn't want to create an ID card that only the undocumented would use. And essentially it becomes a sort of stigmatizing program to say that this is the card, by showing the card, you are essentially showing that you are undocumented. So what we did was design an ID card that really appeals to all New Yorkers. And we created something that looks a lot like a driver's license, so it has the security features and the kind of credibility of government-issued ID. It also has a number of benefits that your driver's license does not have. As an example, we have built into it prescription drug discounts. You can list emergency contact and preferred language. You can use it as your library card. And you can also use it to get free memberships for a year at 33 of the city's top cultural institutions. Places like Lincoln Center, the Brooklyn Botanical Garden, large and small sort of gems of New York's cultural world are part of this ID card. So as a result of sort of the wide range of benefits and features of the card, the demand for it when we launched the program on January 12th, and the response in New York City was pretty phenomenal. In less than a year, we have more than 600,000 people who have signed up for the card. And what's been particularly remarkable is the mix of people. So if you map out where the enrollments have been, you see, of course, huge numbers in immigrant neighborhoods like Corona, Queens. In fact, in Corona, 1 out of 5 people has an ID NYC card. That's, for us, a huge victory from the perspective of really reaching immigrant families who are our target population. But we also know that lots of other New Yorkers have their ID NYC, and so we were able to destigmatize a program that could have had some negative effects if not done properly. And I think this is an example of how a large city like New York can think about immigrant inclusion and immigrant integration. When you have this challenge that's really imposed by a government at other levels, right, the inability to get identification, what does a city do to respond, and how can you structure it in such a way that you're addressing the needs of immigrant families but also making a program that's more broadly appealing? I will mention that we also have a healthcare program that we're launching right now, and maybe in the Q&A or discussion I can talk about it a little bit more. A couple of other things to flag. On access to justice, one of the big challenges that New York City faces, or one of the big issues that New York City faces, is that we have 700,000 people who tomorrow could apply to become US citizens but haven't done so. And there are a wide variety of reasons for that, some of which are cost, lack of access to quality legal services, and we've really been thinking about both how do we build services and embed them in the urban institutions that families are using, places like libraries, but how do we also scale our outreach? So one of the things we did recently and learned recently by looking at the data the city holds itself, that half of those 700,000 people have some relationship to a city agency. We have contact with them already. So one of the things we've really been grappling with is how does government communicate with and relate to people who are already interacting with us about programs and services that could really benefit them down the line, and citizenship is one area where we've really been exploring some of those questions. And then finally, I will just say on national advocacy, I'm sure many of you have been following and hearing that the national climate on immigration right now is really toxic. And in a city like New York, where really across political spectrums, the emphasis has been on inclusion of immigrants, it was, in Mayor de Blasio's opinion, important that we get together with sister cities around the country and advocate for changes at the federal level, both in terms of the narrative dialogue right now, but more in terms of the laws and programs that we see coming down from the federal level. So this coalition, Cities United for Immigration Action, has been around for less than a year, and we have been working to both disseminate best practices. About 24 cities around the country came to New York to talk about municipal ID programs, for example, but we've also been advocating on some of the sorts of issues that you hear about in the news these days, including the refugee crisis. And so it continues to be an infrastructure that cities are using to come together and be able to tell their story at the national level. And I will stop there and leave my contact information in case you'd like to be in touch in the future. Thank you.
Hello, I'm delighted to be here today, and I really thank AGS and Professor Price for the invitation. I am not a geographer technically, but everything I do is informed by comparative spatial perspective, and I've been looking at immigrant settlement trends and the implications comparatively across US places. So I'll talk a little bit about that today. Everyone knows the United States has a long history of immigration, but the past 2 decades have been especially notable. Since the 1990s, new immigrant settlement trends have emerged with unprecedented numbers of immigrants seeking opportunity in metropolitan areas with little recent history of immigration. But most of this new geography of immigrant settlement is a result of longer-term processes, including the restructuring of the US economy, a decades-long shift from manufacturing-dominant economy to one based on knowledge and service jobs. And that's been shaping migration patterns of both the native-born and the foreign-born, and this, we see this underlying the changing geography of settlement. Over a longer period of time has been the decentralization of cities and the growth of the suburbs as major residential and employment centers. And we now have large agglomerations of central cities and suburbs making up these metropolitan areas. Over 50 in the US have more than 1 million residents, and the top 10 have 5 million or more. And as Nisha pointed out, the US immigration policy has been the purview of the federal government for more than 100 years. Decisions about enforcement actions, the design of admissions, the processing and adjudication of visas, both temporary and permanent, the criteria by which immigrants may apply to become citizens, have traditionally been the responsibility of Congress and federal agencies, but we are currently in an impasse, and we have been for quite some time. And so I think it's fair to say that almost all of the policy that's happening around immigration, save for some large federal programs on enforcement, is now happening at state and local levels. And of course, most recently in the past couple of days, we've seen governors come together to put pressure on the administration to block the entry of Syrian refugees. So in the past, immigration was largely a matter of concern for big cities along the coasts and in areas in the Southwest. This is a map in 1900 of the major immigrant destinations. And you can see they're all in the Midwest or the Northeast, around the Great Lakes in the Midwest, save for San Francisco. And by 2010, that map has changed. Many of those places were no longer ranked at the top. Many metropolitan areas in the South and the West took their place. So the metros in blue were, in both periods of time, made the top 20. This is a graph that consolidates the top 5 metros or cities of settlement for each decade between 1900 and 2010. So it gives you a sense of the historical changes and shifts during the entire 20th century and beyond a little bit, because we go to 2010 here. And that red bar at the top shows the 50% point. So you can see that for most of the 20th century, immigrants lived in just 5 places. But you can also see, if you can read the text in the back, the rise and fall of some cities such as Pittsburgh in the early part of the 20th century, Detroit in the middle part of the century drops away, and also the continuity of certain places, for example, New York and Chicago, which both scored a top spot in every single decade across this period. And then in the later part of the 20th century, after World War II, you can see the rise of Los Angeles and Miami showing up in the middle and moving towards the end. They're on there. But as I mentioned, the most important thing to notice is at the end, that red line, and at the end you can see that the share that lived in just 5 places has dropped considerably in the last 2 decades, representing a spreading out into a lot of different areas across the country. And this is too much to take in at one time, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, except to say that it's coming out in a forthcoming piece that you'll be able to look at on the web and study it. But this is also from 1900 to 2014, using the latest ACS data. This consolidates metropolitan areas into 7 immigrant gateway types. And you can see what happens to all of them as they're aggregated into these different categories over time. So on the bottom, the red, those are former immigrant gateways like Buffalo and Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Detroit. What share of the total foreign-born population they make up, or the total in the immigrant gateways. And then the orange are the major continuous immigrant gateways. There are some minor continuous immigrant gateways. So the majors, there are only 4. New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and Boston. And there are some minor continuous gateways that have had similar pattern, but more modest size populations. And then there are the emerging gateways, the ones in green. Oh, sorry, the ones in green are the post-World War II, like Miami, LA, Houston. And then the emerging, there's a set of 3 emerging gateways at the top in blue, and they include the re-emerging immigrant gateways, major and minor emerging immigrant gateways. So these are different trends in settlement in terms of re-emerging, like Seattle and the Twin Cities. These are places that look just like those big immigrant gateways in the early part of the 20th century, but in the middle they became largely native-born, and now they're on the rise again, in part due to refugee resettlement and in part due to other immigrants moving to those places. And the emerging gateways, in terms of the major emerging gateways like Atlanta, these are places that have seen tremendous growth in the foreign-born population very recently with little history. And then there's some newcomers that are smaller in size, like Nashville, for example, that have seen incredibly fast growth. So not only are there new immigrant metropolitan destinations within metro areas, we see a lot of changes. And this just shows the fact that immigrants mostly lived, this is 1980 at the top bar, 2010 at the bottom. And in 1980, you can see there were similar shares of immigrants living in cities and suburbs. And then the other 2 pieces are smaller metropolitan areas and non-metropolitan areas. But over time, and if you look in 2010, you can see that there are now more immigrants in the suburbs than in cities. And in fact, the majority of immigrants in the United States lives in a suburb of a major metropolitan area, 51% versus 33% in the cities. And it's been fairly constant, 10, 11% in smaller metro areas and about 5% in non-metro. And I'm gonna have to close, but I wanna talk about, I will just flash this up here because I think the reason why I'm interested in this work and why we should all be interested in this work has to do with our integration policies. And Nisha set me up very nicely for that, to talk about that. But there are choices that states and localities have, municipalities have. Some are intentionally integrative, like the Municipal ID card in New York. These are usually programs that are aimed at all immigrants or a broader group of people, as she described for that program. They're usually focused on public services, public safety, public health issues. They include language access, healthcare, education, and of course things like the ID card. And then there are more restrictive policies, and that's why I have an enforcement-focused picture on the left. These are often choices that places make to control immigration to the extent that they can, and it's aimed primarily, these policies and practices are often aimed primarily at the unauthorized population or the undocumented population, but it often spills over to other people with other statuses, often in the same households, usually enforcement focused, and includes restrictions on hiring, renting, licensing, benefits, and other local law enforcement cooperation programs. So I'm going to end with that because we can talk about that when we're all done with our presentations. Thank you.
Hello all, I'm David Rain from George Washington University. I was appreciated Marie Price's invitation to come here and speak about African migration and urbanization. I speak in the face of undeniable arresting images of bodies washing up on beaches and the grisly image of wheel well stowaways coming in to Heathrow Airport. These are arresting images, but in a lot of ways this picture is completely incomplete, if not misleading. Rather, it's really the inexorable movement of people from rural villages to urban settlements of all sizes on the continent of Africa, something that has gone by the name of the rural exodus for many, many decades, but which has accelerated in recent years. So you may look at this picture and say, oh, that's a nice looking village, not too far from the border with Nigeria. This is the outskirts of Maradi, which is the second or third largest city in Niger. And these sorts of settlements, which look a lot like rural villages, have cropped up around in the peri-urban areas around many cities in West Africa. And they're often inhabited by temporary migrants, those who have connections or who still have ties to rural villages, but who have come to the city to seek opportunities and have still maintain a lot of connections with what we could think of as the sending areas. These guys are making rope, and this is an activity which I called post-harvest activities. It's something that would normally happen in a village after the food is harvested. You take the crop residues, you weave and make roofing and fencing and so forth. But what's happened is a lot of these activities have been moved to the city and they've become monetized. So these guys are making money from the bundles of rope that they sell. They're maintaining their ties with their wives and families back in the village. It's really not a new practice. The newness of it is really in the new economic relations that are embodied in this. And often in my teaching, I often use this term urbanization of poverty, because really these are very poor people and they've moved to the city and they've brought their lifestyles and their economic potential with them. This photo is on the outskirts of Accra. If you can imagine big traffic jam, people selling things to all the waiting cars. I would ask you to look at this from a public health perspective. You have a lot of folks who are breathing a lot of exhaust for hours and hours and hours every day. It does present a lot of health challenges, and yet people are coming in droves in order to get a piece of this economic opportunity pie, and often maintaining their ties with rural villages. It's another picture from Accra. This is the big Muslim slum of Nima, which has been studied in a lot of detail. We did focus groups there and found a very high level of identity and self-empowerment in this particular slum, even though it had very, very high population densities and certainly a lot of public health challenges. These are one of the slums we would call a slum of hope, because people did feel that they were empowered and that they had a political voice, and they were very well organized. This map shows the growth of satellite cities in the outskirts of Accra. This is documented by Ian Yeboah from Miami. Peri-urban settlement is really the name of the game, and the big question is, why are people moving to places like this and not to the urban core? And the answers they'll give you, because I've heard them say so myself, is that they feel as though the urban core is full. They feel like it's too expensive. In some of the older neighborhoods of Accra, people are converting their bathrooms to sort of mini apartment rooms that they can rent out just to make a little bit of extra money. Next couple slides just document this spread from land cover from Landsat. So this is in 2000s, as courtesy of my colleague Ryan Angrom. So you see Accra along the coast there, and that gray urban built up designation, and then from 2010, the spread of the city. And so it's not really suburbanization, it's really just extra territory, and these are often, if there are existing houses there, they've been subdivided and with every available room converted. Again, from my colleague Ryan Angrom, this is impervious surface, and this raises a big question. I'm glad to hear about the dual sewer outflow topic brought up earlier for New York City. DC also has a big problem with combined sewage and stormwater going into the same pipes. The problem for Accra is similar in that people are paving the city, basically, and it's creating a lot of flooding problems for those living downstream. And this is something that's actually happening across Africa. Many coastal cities are experiencing this with increased severity of floods, and often the neighborhoods that are at the lowest elevation are taking the brunt of it. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this particular image except to show that the standard practice is to pave with cement. Your compound, putting in metal roofs and so on, has the effect of concentrating rainfall and creating flood conditions. So lots of documented flooding throughout the history of Accra. Most recently, there was a disaster that came from a bunch of people huddling at a gas station, and there was a spark that went off and over 100 people were killed. This happened in June. So what used to be a pretty infrequent event is now becoming a very common occurrence in Accra, and I know cities in Cameroon, Nigeria, and so forth are also experiencing this over and over. So this was just highlighting the work of one of our master's students from the GW Geography program who created a slum map and overlaid that with the drainage canals for Accra, and we estimated the populations at risk from flooding from a 10, 50, 100-year flood. It's tens of thousands of people, particularly those living in slum areas. It'd be good to see more of this kind of analysis for other cities, I should say. Another big factor is slum clearance. This happened at the height of the flooding in June. The Accra municipal authorities moved in with bulldozers and took out probably the poorest and most notorious slum of Accra, something that is known locally as Sodom and Gomorrah, seen as the den of thieves and so forth. And those people did not have any recourse. It's a fairly uncommon occurrence in Accra, but it did get a lot of press. So what I'd like to finish with is some emerging issues, and I hope this doesn't seem too in the weeds, but these are very pressing issues for Accra residents and really for Ghana as a whole. Problems of electricity and water. So a new word has emerged out of Ghana in recent years, and that is dumsor, which means on-off, the perennial electricity shortages. And this is in a way really an offshoot of success and economic growth, that more people are using air conditioning, they want to have lights and so on, and the infrastructure is very, very challenged. Self-governance in informal areas, a lot of slums are sort of no-go zones for government. Involved in a project right now in Nairobi that's looking at self-governance in one of their particular slums. The gendering of migration flows, so something new. Traditionally, it was men who migrated to cities. Now and more you see women, and the word on the street is that women, really teenage girls, have much more earning potential than young men. And unfortunately, this is associated with the sex trade, and there's a big dimension to this that I think has not been pointed out very much. Traffic alleviation. I mentioned the public health risks of bad air pollution. Traffic is horrendous in Accra, as it is in many places, and if you just think about all of the economic opportunity that's missed out by waiting in a traffic jam. And then the last one, I think, but don't want to make this too doom and gloom and give you a bit of hope, is that tax revenues can only go up. And this is partly by the use of geospatial technology. So there's a project going on right now to create a digital cadastral database for tax purposes. So not too unknown secret in a lot of African cities that people will pay bribes to avoid paying taxes. And with the emergence of these digital databases, the city can go after people who haven't paid their taxes. And this money could be used for developing infrastructure. And so this is one, so I'm gonna just throw these out there. If you wanna come back to them and ask more questions about them, I'd be happy to talk about them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. All right, we're going to shoot out now to a global view on what are some of the global immigrant gateways of the future. Just to remind everybody that actually immigrants, and I'm going to focus on immigrants rather than internal migrants, only 3.2% of the world's population have left their country of birth and are residing in another state for a period of more than a year. It's still a lot of people, 235 million people, but you can see it hasn't changed all that much, 2 or 3%. And I don't anticipate that growth happening too much more. There's a lot of barriers that keep people from not moving. But interestingly, this is UNDP data, this is not mine. It looks at, these are the regional trends in growth. Europe is the largest destination of this foreign-born immigrant stock, but Asia has grown significantly. What they mean by Asia, a very large area to be sure, is really the growth in Southwest Asia, or what we often call the Middle East, enormous growth in the foreign-born. North America has also seen some growth, but it's smaller. And then Africa, Latin America, and Oceania have actually rather static compared to these other growth areas. So again, this is the mega regional perspective. Nationally, here you see some countries that have experienced significant growth in the last 13 years, and the United States is certainly one of them. Probably the most noteworthy one is that Russia has seen a decline. And that's more a kind of aging out. There was a lot of movement after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and people that were part of the Soviet Union then became foreign-born if they moved to new republics. And then this is the map of showing, again, at the state level, which are the countries that have 10% or more foreign-born. Not that many, but there's some of the typical settler nations. But increasingly more states have, say, 5% of their population being foreign-born. But when we shift to the city, the pattern really changes. And this is a collaborative work I did with my colleague Lisa Benton-Short and also a sociologist, Sam Friedman at Albany. We tried to gather data on the foreign-born at the metropolitan scale for cities all over the world, and a lot of this data reflect the status of the number of foreign-born in cities around 10 years ago. There's always a lag time in terms of collecting this data. But what's quite obvious is that North America, Europe, and Southwest Asia are the dominant destinations of immigrants. Now, this is my million-person map, and these are looking, or million-city map. These are cities, metropolitan areas, not just the city proper, that have over 1 million foreign-born. And since this map has been produced, I would need to add 3 more cities, and they're in each of one. Madrid has over 1 million foreign-born. Doha now has over 1 million foreign-born, and so does Buenos Aires. So now there are 21 cities in the world that I'm pretty confident in have over 1 million foreign-born, and those 21 cities represent 20% of all the world's foreign-born that are recorded through the stock data that the UN estimates. So again, these data are not always perfect, but it does show that 1 in 5 immigrants are in these major destinations. So these global cities that are attracting large and diverse flows are really important places that we need to study and think about. If I were able to, I would add 20 more cities where I think the 2050 will be included. So I can't, I'll try to point them out here. In the Americas, we'll add 2 more in Canada. I think Vancouver and Montreal will easily be cities of over 1 million foreign-born. And in the US, Riverside's almost there, so is San Jose and Atlanta. They'll probably be there in the next 10 years. And I would also include Phoenix and Boston for 5 more cities. South America is pretty blank at this point, but Buenos Aires is already there at 1 million, and I think Sao Paulo also has the potential. In Europe, Madrid is one of the 1 million immigrant cities now. I would also add Barcelona and Berlin. In Southwest Asia, Doha could be added, but also Kuwait City and Istanbul are likely to be in this map in 2050. In Asia, I think it's quite likely that Tokyo and Seoul are showing growing trends in foreign-born. So is Kuala Lumpur, so it'd be added next to Singapore. And then in mainland China, we don't have a lot of good data on that, but I was recently at an IOM meeting, and the city of Guangzhou now says it has 200,000 foreign-born, which is likely to increase. It's probably one of the more open cities in terms of trade. And I think Shanghai may get there by 2050. Africa is also doesn't have a lot of these cities, but I would be pretty confident that Johannesburg and Cape Town in South Africa would join, and possibly Accra, though it might just hang there in the 500,000 mark. So what does this mean? By 2050, rather than 21 of these cities that are major immigrant destinations, we'll double that. We'll have 40, and they might actually have a larger percentage of the world's immigrants in them. But how will these cities function? And this is the key issue I'd like to end with. There's a choice that is being made all the time as states and cities erect their immigration policies. And that is, do we want policies in which immigrants are integrated into the society, part of the society? Do they become citizens? Are they allowed to remain, vote, participate? Or what I see happening more and more are these conditional workers. The idea, and very much modeled in what we see in some of the Gulf states, workers that might be in a city for many years, even decades, but have very limited rights, are not at all allowed to become formal citizens, and in many ways quite excluded from the dominant population, but their labor is definitely needed. And then the bigger variable is what will happen with refugee flows in the future. All of us probably have Paris in the back of our mind, or the images of Syrians trying to cross into Europe. But with climate change, the potential for many significant flows of people that we haven't recognized before, there's certainly an enormous pressure to keep those migration flows within states rather than crossing borders, but sometimes that's not an option. So there are choices to be made, whether we as citizens and residents of cities and countries want to be inclusionary, want to be very exclusionary, and then future flows that we cannot control. Thank you very much. So having taken all the time, I think we could take one question, John, one or two. Are there any questions from the floor? Comments? All right, we stunned you to silence. Then I will end it at that. The panelists will be here, and we'd be eager to talk with you. Thank you very much.